Nikos Syropoulos, welcome to Inside the Taubman Approach.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to talk to you today, Benjamin.
Nikos, how did you come to the Taubman work?
It's a good question. It was a pretty life-changing moment for me, so I do have a good story about it, I suppose. So I first came to the Taubman work in 2008, and at the time I was a junior at the University of Southern California. I was getting my bachelor's of music in jazz piano studies. At that, rather leading up to that, I'd been playing piano my whole life. I started when I was 4. I started classically, actually, at first with Suzuki. And then I found jazz in middle school and high school. And up to 2008, I had never had any pain at the piano at all. Never had any injury. Piano it came fairly easily to me. It felt, I didn't really have any challenges in that way. But then in 2008, I had some really scary pain that, it was pretty terrifying actually. So I remember very vividly, I was in the middle of a big band concert with school, and just seemingly out of nowhere, I had this incredibly sharp shooting pain that ran all the way from my fingertips up my forearm, and it felt like this bolt of lightning, and it was really scary. And then it actually happened in my other arm as well. So I had to stop the concert. Fortunately, a lot of big band music doesn't have the piano as a crucial piece. So I actually stopped in the middle of the concert and they continued without me. And I was really, really freaked out because I had never had anything like this happen to me before. And then I continued to be freaked out when the pain continued even when I wasn't playing. So I had this pain in my, it was predominantly in my forearms. It was also in my hands, not really as much in my fingers, but it was, anytime I tried to play at first, it was very, very painful. So I took a break. My teachers were very accommodating. They were like, whatever you need to do, if you take some time. So during this break, which ended up lasting a couple of months, I tried a lot of different things to get better. Stubbornly refused to admit that maybe my piano technique was part of the problem at first because, like I said, I'd never had issues with pain before. So first I went to physical therapy, and they were like, oh yeah, you need to strengthen your back and you need to strengthen your core. And I didn't disagree with them, but it didn't help me. Didn't help at all, actually. I did that for several weeks, and there was no change. And throughout all of this, I'm like, every day I'm taking the maximum amount of ibuprofen that's allowed. I'm icing all the time. It's difficult to fall asleep. It's really troubling. So I'm looking for answers everywhere. And then after physical therapy, I tried acupuncture, which I had never done. Not a huge fan of needles, so that was kind of awful for me. I've heard that acupuncture is very helpful for some people, but for me it was terrible. Then the last person that I tried was, I actually don't even remember who they were, it doesn't matter, but they did this sort of electric shock thing on my arms and then went in very, very deeply with very intense, deep massage right into my forearms. And, this person was recommended by some string players I knew at USC who studied with some folks who played in the LA Phil. And they're like, oh yeah, this guy makes it possible for me to play. I can go to him for a tune-up, That just made it worse. And so at this point, this was maybe the end of 2008, early 2009, and I was really, really depressed. It was just, it was awful. I was at that point, after that didn't work, I was worried that I wouldn't be able to finish my degree. I wouldn't be able to have a career as a pianist, frankly. So during this time, I'm in LA. My parents are in Philadelphia. And my mom in particular was like asking around, like how can we help? And my younger brother, who was in high school at the time, he's a saxophone player, and he was studying with this local legend, Larry McKenna, this jazz saxophone player. And my mom was talking to him one day during their lesson, and Larry McKenna was like, yeah, you should talk to this guy, Tom Lawton. He's this jazz pianist in Philly, and he had an injury, I think, or I can't remember, and he found this teacher that cured him. And my mom was, okay, yeah, let's do that. So she gets in touch with Tom, met only once actually, and who's delightful, and I don't think he even really fully knows how much he helped change my life, honestly. But he introduced me to his teacher, Bob Durso, who really turned things around for me. So I got in touch with Bob in, I want to say, the beginning of 2009, maybe the end of 2008. I can't remember now. And I flew out to Philly around 2009 President's Day weekend, and I took 4 lessons with him. And immediately there was like, there is an answer here, no question. I didn't immediately have all of my pain go away, but I could finish the semester. I could start to play a little bit more. So that was just after 4 lessons where, one of the main things that Bob showed me actually initially was, sort of the basic things of what not to do at the piano. One of the big ones that, I've talked about with pretty much every student at the beginning is not to twist, right? And so hindsight, I looked back and I realized that right before, maybe a couple months before my injury, I had started doing this exercise that my teacher had recommended, not necessarily as a technical thing, more of a harmonic exercise.
Okay, sure.
But the idea was to not use sustain pedal at all and to try to make it legato and do it in all 12 keys, as many jazz pianists do. I ended up doing a tremendous amount of twisting, and I'm convinced that led to some of the initial, like the acute injury. Anyway, I studied with Bob for those 4 lessons and then was like, yes, this is the answer. There's no question in my mind. So that summer, I committed to studying with him in Philly. I moved back home for the summer and retrained with him very intensely for a couple months. And that fully cured me of the pain within that time. Wow. And then that was just life-changing right there. It was like this huge, like nonstop aha moment. It was like, oh, that's not only can I be out of pain, but like it just opened this whole new world to playing the piano. So that's why I initially came to the work, unfortunately through injury, as a lot of folks do. But then after that, that was 2009. And then I lived in Los Angeles. I continued to live in LA after I graduated in 2010. And at the time, remote lessons weren't really that popular, right? So like I basically, for between 2010 and 2018, I took intermittent lessons with Bob whenever I visited my parents. So a couple times a year. I also went to some of the Golandsky Institute workshops. So yeah, between 2010 and 2018, I was working as a freelance musician in LA, and Taubman Approach had really positively affected my life, but I wasn't super deep into it after the retraining. But then when I moved from LA, I moved to Oregon where I live now. I decided that I wanted to recommit to the Taubman Approach, and in the process entered into the teacher certification program. So actually before I moved to Oregon, I moved very briefly to Philly and studied much more regularly with Bob, went much deeper, and then after a couple of years, after a couple of years, I got certified by the Golandsky Institute to be an instructor. And that's where I am today.
The rest is history.
Yeah.
I'm interested in hearing your perspective as a jazz pianist. Many of the folks that are involved in the Taubman work are classical piano players, and there are set skills and movements that are related to the Taubman approach that are applied to classical literature. How has it been for you as a jazz pianist who improvises, who composes on the fly, so to speak? How has that been for you in terms of learning these amazing movements in the Taubman approach and then applying it to your jazz idiom?
Yeah. It's a really good question. It is something that I think a lot about, that I think about with my own playing, with some of my own students on a regular basis. So there are many, I'd say, unique challenges for improvising musicians when studying the Taubman approach. So usually when you're starting with the Taubman approach, let's say you're going through the retraining first, right? You do the retraining and then you study a piece of music like a classical sonata or something like that. And then after you've done that and you've integrated the movements more or less within your body, then you start working on other pieces. What I did with Bob, and I'm sure what other jazz musicians do as well, is, after that initial period of retraining and then working on a classical piece, then you start working on usually transcriptions of jazz pianists, of jazz greats, of really trying to get a really full picture of the type of vocabulary that you play. So in some ways, it's not that different from what a classical musician would go through. However, that still doesn't really paint a full picture of what it's like physically to improvise. Some people, I think, might disagree about this, but I think that when you improvise, a lot of the times you really don't know what you're about to play. Sometimes you end up surprising yourself when you're playing something. Sometimes you can't remember what you just played. It just happened. And, I think one of the things that I've had to come to terms with over the years, and that I try to instill into all of my students, is that in spite of the amazing precision that we're able to accomplish with the Taubman approach, expecting perfection within improvisation is likely not going to happen. So the reality is, it's a difficult reality it's been hard for me, and I know for a lot of folks, to accept that reality, especially for the folks who have, say, some perfectionist tendencies like I do, where, you learn about how detailed, how comprehensive you can be about making any passage as easy and as precise as possible when you work on it with your teacher. But then when you improvise something, you play something that you haven't played before. And maybe you miss a rotation or a couple rotations, or maybe the shaping is off, or maybe some elements of it are not as precise as you want. And I think first and foremost, accepting that is part of the reality, that you're not going to necessarily be able to have the same degree of perfection. Now, that doesn't mean that it will feel worse than, let's say, how you were before studying the Taubman approach. But that's the first thing that comes to mind with that. There are a number of other things that I could talk about that jazz pianists deal with, but the issue of perfectionism, I think, is the first thing that comes to mind. Yeah.
Indeed. And so if a jazz pianist comes to you and is reticent, has heard different things about the Taubman work in the World Wide Web or or word of mouth, and has sort of, reticent feelings towards it, what would you say to a jazz pianist that is skeptical but might be interested in pursuing the amazing Taubman approach? What would you say to them?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I've had that happen many a time.
I'm sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, I would say, like, first of all, I mean, for any pianist, whether they're a jazz pianist or not, if they're just reticent about the approach, the first thing that I tend to say is, like, there's something for everybody. I know people have different misconceptions about what the Taubman approach is, and we could get into that. But the first thing that I tell anybody is no matter what your skill level or your age or your style or the music you play, there is something for you within the Taubman approach. And I strongly believe that there's a lot there. So I mean, I teach a wide range of pianists from, kids to adults, amateurs, college students, professionals. And the Taubman work is it's an essential part of what I do now. So if you're reticent about it for any reason, I'd say, you can rest easy. There is something for you. I'd also wager that most folks, regardless of the genre that they play the most folks are reticent about the approach because of the mystery surrounding the retraining process.
Indeed. Okay.
And I think that the mystery has been revealed to be not so mysterious over the past couple of years, but there's still a lot of misinformation and maybe some horror stories from people who I would guess are maybe folks who have not studied with a certified teacher and that whole thing. And so, first of all, to a reticent pianist, yes, I want to recognize that it can be intimidating and it can be scary to think, oh, wow, I have to maybe not necessarily play music for a little bit, And I know that not everybody can take the time to do that. It is a commitment. I don't want to sugarcoat it in any way, right? It is a serious commitment, but the payoff is not just this small thing. It is something that can I think that it's fundamentally worth it because of the skills that really last you a lifetime. This is not just some small thing that is just a small benefit. Maybe you learn how to play a little faster, or you learn how to get a little more control. It has the potential, depending on how deep you go, to really transform the way that you interact with the instrument for the better. So specifically for an injured person, if you're reticent, I'd say don't waste your time waiting. Like, I've heard so many stories. I mean, you've just heard my story of how I guess back in 2008, 2009, YouTube was just kind of starting. There wasn't really, I didn't even know the Taubman approach existed, right? Like, now the amount of information out there is so much greater. So it's a lot easier to find out about it. I don't even know if there were YouTube videos of the Taubman approach back then, honestly. But, now there's the Golandsky streaming and all sorts of things. So, right. So if you're injured, don't wait. Just try it. Find a certified teacher. And it is a commitment. The commitment varies from person to person because every pianist is different. Everyone brings their own habits and their own things to it. And jazz musicians have their own specific habits. Not just jazz musicians, but improvising musicians. I'd say there's an incredibly wide range of pianists who play jazz, some of whom don't have any technical experience. Maybe they didn't play classical music before, and they're all self-taught. I wasn't self-taught. I studied classically before I did jazz, and then I came to jazz. And I think that one of the challenges that I come against a little bit with some jazz musicians is that we're taught sort of very early on that you need to find your own voice. And this is not just something with jazz, but it is with all musicians, but specifically with jazz. There are so many examples of legendary jazz musicians whose technique let's just say, I mean, the easy example to pick on, not because he had bad technique, but perhaps odd technique, was Thelonious Monk, someone who you watch play and you think, I don't know how you physically do that. Or someone like McCoy Tyner, you watch them play and you think, I don't know how you are doing that and that you're not in debilitating pain.
Right.
Or Keith Jarrett, or some of these pianists who you see play and their technique is not Taubman Approach looking like. So a lot of the times you have people who are very influenced by this idea that they don't want to look like somebody else. They want to be able to find their own voice. And I respect that, but at the same time, and it's sometimes it is a little bit harder to explain early on, basically, that like, I'm not trying to change how you play, like what you play. I'm not trying to change even how you sound, how you play it. I'm just usually trying to make sure that you can play easily, you can play solidly, and that you can play sustainably. Yeah. So if someone is reticent about it, I get it. I respect it. There are many reasons for it, but there are plenty of really well-qualified teachers to help you with it.
And I want to follow up with that to our audience to say, yes, take Nikos's advice, go to GolandskyInstitute.org and find our Find a Teacher program. You can sign up for a teacher and we can pair you with a certified teacher through the Golandsky Institute. It's very important. It's actually vital to have somebody who the Taubman work deeply and who is certified so that you don't go through a period of yet even more frustration with somebody that doesn't know what they're doing with this incredible work. What kinds of things are you discovering right now in the Taubman work that kind of fires you up, so to speak, Nikos?
Yeah. Well, I mean, honestly, there are new things every day, which in and of itself is really inspiring. Really small things, really just every day I come to the piano and I realize that there is a new nuance that has made itself known somehow through the work. After the retraining, the work really is about really fine adjustments. And over time, the technique gets more and more precise. It gets quieter, so to speak, more controlled. And so the new discoveries, I find that it's just amazing that I can still improve.
Mm-hmm.
And it's that in and of itself is amazing to me, because I'd say before I came to the Taubman approach, well, for one thing, I didn't really think about technique very much at all. I kind of took for granted what my skill level was at the piano, and I felt like I was growing musically a lot, especially in high school and college. But I think in hindsight, I had probably plateaued with my own technical abilities. But now it's a constant discovery of how much better I can get technically at the instrument, which I don't want folks to just think that getting better at technique means just being able to play faster or something. I see it as such a more wide-ranging thing of really being able to express yourself at the instrument with so much more confidence. And I think that that's something that I'm discovering all the time. It's just certain things you just feel so much more confident with in a way that is hard to explain, honestly. So that's one thing. The level of confidence that continues to grow is amazing. And some of the other things that I've been working on lately do relate directly to some of the challenges I was mentioning about working with jazz musicians. So one of the unique challenges that some jazz and improvising musicians come up against is integrating the new way of moving into how you improvise. We started talking about that before.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the more specific things that I've been looking at with that is I did mention already that jazz musicians tend to work on transcriptions, right? So in addition to starting with a classical piece, then you work on stuff that you're likely to play within, I don't know, you go over transcriptions of jazz greats usually. But what I've been doing lately that I've found pretty effective is you actually have the student themselves, they record themselves improvising in different settings, and then transcribe themselves and work out the choreography of the solos as you would a piece of music. So the idea behind that then being that you can focus on your own unique vocabulary. Mm-hmm. And it can be really enlightening to, improve not only just upon it's an interesting musical exercise. I remember doing it in high school, actually. My teacher asked me to transcribe myself, and it was, from a musical standpoint, just really interesting. Oh, I play this. Oh, I waste so much time doing this. Sure. But then from a technical perspective, realizing how going back and then practice your own solo sort of as you would a piece, not with the idea of performing it or anything, right? But it's really it can be really interesting to see how you can improve how you play the music that you play without thinking about it, right? So you can start to observe certain themes in your own style, educate your body a little bit more specifically on how to execute those types of passages. Mm-hmm. With the goal being that when you improvise something similar to it in the future, the newer, improved way of moving becomes more automatic. And this feeling of it being more automatic is something that is important regardless of what style you play, but is really, really essential for when you're improvising. So if you're not if the way that you approach a certain passage is flawed in some way, say you have some arpeggio-based thing that you do a lot within this bebop tune or this type of thing, if you really get into it more specifically, the idea is you practice it from the solo that you transcribe, and then hopefully next time you do it, it just gets even better and it becomes more instinctive to have the better fingering, the better choreography, all of those things. So those are some, I'd say those are some of the latest discoveries for me.
That is really exciting. And the sky's the limit in terms of the application towards jazz pedagogy on the piano.
Definitely.
And you're on the cutting edge, so to speak, and bringing this amazing work to the jazz idiom. Where can folks find you as a certified teacher? You're in Oregon at the time, at the present time in your career. And how can folks get in touch with you, Nikos?
Sure. Well, my website is Nikos, Nikos, piano, nikospiano.com. And you can also email me at nikospiano.com. And I am also on, social media with basically Nikos Piano. So just remember Nikos Piano, and then you'll be able to find me.
That's fantastic. And we will be sure to include all of these links and Nikos' wonderful accomplishments in the show notes of this podcast episode. Nikos, we've got to continue this conversation in another episode, and I'm sure we'll have you on very soon to talk about even more about the Taubman approach as how it relates to the jazz idiom, and then just your exciting projects that are coming up here. And so we're going to point people to your website. Get in touch with Nikos, go to GolandskyInstitute.org and see him listed there as a certified teacher. Nikos, thank you so much for joining us today on Inside the Taubman Approach.
Yeah, thank you, Benjamin. It's been a pleasure.